So, yeah, I do. I have Kathy. Congratulations. Yeah, okay.
All right, we have a quorum, so we will call this meeting to order. We should go ahead.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Your report.
Yeah, we're going to have to All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. Again, this is the second presentation as a part of a three-part series for this housing study project. The third and final presentation will come in early February, I believe it's February 7th. And so today, I'm here to talk about the draft recommendations. So the way that the project was set up is that we did a data analysis section where we collected a bunch of data, we looked at analyzed secondary data sets, then we turned to the sort of answering the community questions which were put out in the initial RFP. We used the data that we collected to answer those community questions. And then the third part is these recommendations. And so that's primarily what we're going to focus on today. Again, I just want to emphasize that this is a draft. Last time we had really good discussion and questions, and I hope that we get that this time as well. We do have a couple of weeks prior to finalizing the report, so if there's stuff that you see in here that you hate, or there's stuff that you don't see in here that you think should be in here, please do speak up. And there's a SurveyMonkey link at the end of this presentation that will also be available on the website, on the Village of Shorewood's website, where you could go and provide written feedback as well. So for those of you who were not here last time, I'll just do a brief introduction about our company and myself. The company is Novigrad Company. We are a consulting firm. We specialize in housing and community development policy work. We primarily focus on housing needs assessments and housing markets feasibility studies. We do work, as you can see in the map, all over the country, including throughout Wisconsin. Rachel is the partner on this project. I'll just quickly sort of provide. You'll meet her in February. She'll be here to present the final report in February. She's been with Novigrad since 2003, and she, similar to myself, specializes in housing policy. She's a certified real estate appraiser, and she does lots of these sort of community-wide housing reports, as well as appraisals and market studies for project-specific developments. This is my background. I am currently pursuing my PhD in sociology with a focus on public administration and networks. I am also working with Novigrad as a consultant. I've been with them since 2008 now, either as a full-time employee or as a contract consultant while I finish my PhD work. So again, summary of the project. First, the data collection. Then we use that data to answer the community questions. Then we come up with the recommendations. And I do want to say that this was specified in the initial RFP that was put out for this project. So the community questions, which are listed on this page, are exactly what was sort of asked for by the Village of Shorewood. These are questions that you guys were specifically looking for answers to. These are things that we were mostly addressed in the last presentation and will be addressed in this sort of sequential order in the final report. And they cover things like, what are the current demographic characteristics of Shorewood? What are the housing characteristics of Shorewood? What should we expect to change in the foreseeable future? Those sorts of questions. Again, these were primarily covered in the last presentation. That presentation is available online for those of you who want to see it. You can, of course, provide comments to that presentation as well through that SurveyMonkey link, or we can talk about it today, to the extent that you still have questions on that. All right, this I've added because of some comments that we got from last time. I do want to say a couple of things about the data that we're using. Most of the secondary data sets that we use are based on a sample. So it's not they don't survey the entire population. So all of these numbers that we're giving are estimates. Around an estimate is what's called a margin of error. So for example, in the American Community Survey, the estimate of Shorewood for the number of housing units that Shorewood has is 6,344. Okay? But we don't know that it's exactly 6,344. There's a margin of error around that of 198. So what we know is that we can say with 90% confidence that the number of housing units in Shorewood ranges from 6,156 to 6,542 housing units. And the best guess is 6,344. And by guess, I don't want to say guess, I don't want to use guess in such a sort of negative way. The best estimate that can be derived from this data set is the 6,344. Now, a lot of times when people hear this, they're like, oh my gosh, I thought these were exact right numbers, and how can we rely on these and we don't want to use this data set? I do want to say, the American Community Survey by the Census Bureau is the most widely used secondary data set by community planners, by analysts, by researchers, academics, everybody uses this data set. So it's very reliable. It's just that I want to make sure that everybody knows that some of the variation that you see in the numbers that we present is likely due to these margins of errors. So in some slides you might see 6,344 housing units. On another slide you might see 6,500 households that are occupying housing units, and you might think, well, those numbers don't match up. This is the reason why. Is that clear to everybody? Okay. Another weakness of this data set, and this is just a function of Shorewood and Shorewood's size, is that they use 5-year estimates for any community that has fewer than 20,000 people. So what that means is that the data that we present, the most recent data set, covers the time period of 2013 to 2017. It is a rolling survey, so they survey people every year over the course of that 5-year period, and they average that, and that is what is considered the 2017 numbers. But it is a 5-year average over that time period. So when we say things like the number of households has increased in Shorewood, and we are comparing a 5-year average, the 2008 to 2012 year period, to the 2013 to 2017 year period. Does that make sense? So it's a 5-year average on both of those ends. So unfortunately, that's just one of the weaknesses that comes with this data set and being a smaller community. One good thing that you guys have to look forward to is that they're doing the census this year. So ideally, you'll have better numbers in the near future. Of course, it'll be a couple years before they come out. But so then the final caution on this point is that throughout the report, there will be every sort of data, every chart, every graphic should be sourced in some way. While we rely primarily on the American Community Survey, there are other surveys that we also look at that have different kinds of data. For example, HUD has a specific data set specifically to housing and housing affordability. That is a different data set. And so we caution you against trying to make comparisons across these different data sets. So one of the comments that we had, for example, was, how can the median household income be this number in this chart, but I'm not getting that number in this other chart? Well, it's two different data sets, that's why. They're using different sampling designs. They're both reliable. We stand by their reliability, but they do come up with slightly different estimates. All right, so just a quick sort of takeaway from the last presentation, especially for those of you who were not here. Key demographic takeaways, and I think you can see this now. Okay, so what makes Shorewood unique? The population by age was one of the things that we talked about a little bit last time. There's actually a large number of people between the ages of 20 and 34. There was a question about to what extent is this college students? And I can say that I went back and I looked, and approximately 12% of the population is enrolled in, population of Shorewood is enrolled in either college as an undergrad or a grad student. So 12.2%.
Of total.
Of the total population, correct. The number of persons enrolled in college and or grad school within Shorewood has not increased though. So one of the other questions was, well, to what extent are these trends that we're seeing in housing affordability and driven by more college students moving into Shorewood? The answer to that is it doesn't appear that that is the case. There has not been a significant increase in the percentage of the population that is enrolled in college and or grad school. Again, this is the 5-year averages, so this is 2008, 2012, compared to 2013 to 2017. They're similar. The other sort of key trend in terms of population by age was that the senior population growth is going to significantly outpace general population growth. So population is aging.
Sorry, that's a general comment, not a Shorewood.
No, that is Shorewood specific comment. Yes, so senior population growth in Shorewood will outpace general population growth in Shorewood. So the general population growth is projected to be pretty stable, 0.1 to 0.2%, whereas the senior population growth is closer to 1.5%. So outpace.
Can you come to that by, again, the comparison of 08 to 12 versus?
In this case, this is a different data set, so good question. That's the Esri data, and they use American Community Survey data, the raw data files, combined with some other things to make projections. So this would be the 2019 numbers compared to 2024.
So they're projecting?
Yes, so they are projecting that there will be stronger senior population growth as opposed to general population growth.
So what are they projecting off of?
Whatever baseline data set they're using. So chances are they're using the American Community Survey as their baseline data set.
Okay.
So then household types, one thing that makes Shorewood very unique is that nearly half of Shorewood households are actually non-family households. A family household would be 2 or more people who are related by marriage or birth or adoption living together. A non-family household is either someone living by themselves or people who are living together who are not related by one of those different relations. The average household size in Shorewood is much smaller than the national average. And the median household income, while it's higher, the median household income of Shorewood is higher than that of the nation, the state, and the MSA, within which Shorewood is located. It's actually lower than that of the surrounding comparable communities, Wauwatosa and Whitefish Bay. And I wanted to say one thing about this, because this came up in one of the comments as well, was, well, to what extent is that being driven by the larger percentage of renter households in Shorewood? And the answer to that is actually a lot. The median household income of owner households in Shorewood is actually higher than Wauwatosa, and it's similar to that of Whitefish Bay. So it's actually the median household income of renters that's really driving that being a little bit lower in this community than in other communities. Not only is it the median household income of renters specifically, but it's also that there's just more renters here than there are in those other communities.
Can you remind us maybe the difference from a percentage perspective of renters in Shorewood versus surrounding communities?
54%, I believe it was, in Shorewood, and the surrounding communities anywhere from 30 to 45%. Significantly different, yeah. And then projections, the population, and this is from the Wisconsin's Department of Administration, I believe. They're projecting that the population in Shorewood will remain relatively stable between now and 2040, but the number of households is going to increase slightly, and as a result, the average household size is going to continue to decline. Again, slightly, it's not a big change. All right, housing takeaways. Shorewood is increasingly becoming a renter community. And in this case, I wanted to sort of put up what the typical renter profile is, because we had talked about, well, to what extent are these things overlapping? The large number of younger people, the renter households, the non-family households. So the sort of typical renter profile in Shorewood would be a non-family householder. Again, this is somebody who is living either by themselves or with someone that they are not married to or have children with or adopted by or have children that they have adopted. Between the ages of 15 and 34 or 65 and over. The typical owner profile is basically the inverse of that, a married couple family where the primary householder is between 35 and 64 years of age. So the majority of lower income households in Shorewood are in fact renters, and particularly extremely low income renters. Now I will say another thing that we looked at after the last presentation was sort of the geographic and spatial distribution of where the extremely low income renters are, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but they are very much located or concentrated in the southwest corner of Shorewood, and that is because that's where River Park is, which is a Section 8 property that targets extremely low-income seniors. So as a result, that's where most of the extremely low-income renters are showing up in the data. Did you have a question? Sorry, I don't want to miss you. No? Okay. And then the last thing was the cost burden of households. So when compared to other areas, actually, Shorewood is doing pretty comparable or even better. In other words, there are fewer households here that are cost burdened than in these other areas that we compared Shorewood to. However, that doesn't negate the fact that within Shorewood, still 31.2% of all households are cost burdened. And just to remind you, the definition of cost burden is a household that spends more than 30% of their income on their housing costs. So nearly a third of households in Shorewood are still considered cost burdened. So that's fairly sizable.
Housing costs?
So for renters, it would be the actual rent plus your utilities. For owners, it's the mortgage plus the property taxes and mortgage insurance if you carry it. And the majority of cost-burdened households in Shorewood are, in fact, renter households. So 61% of the households that are cost-burdened are renters. 70% of severely cost-burdened households are renters. Severely cost-burdened means you spend more than 50% of your income on housing costs. So the majority are, in fact, renters. However, having said that, if you are a moderate income or below owner household, then you are more likely than your renter counterparts to experience this hardship. Essentially, that means if you are an owner household and you happen to have an extremely low income, say for example you're a senior, you bought your home, you've since retired, your income is significantly lower, the chances that you are now, if you're living on Social Security alone, are going to experience this hardship is actually almost 100%. Whereas your renter counterparts who have that same sort of income are less likely to experience that. All right, Shorewood, another housing takeaway. Shorewood has formal affordable housing units. What I mean by formal is that they are sort of obligated contractually to be affordable or to target people with low incomes. River Park, which is the Section 8 senior property that I was talking about, which is 427 units. And actually Light Horse, which I did not know this last time, and I found out doing follow-up research with that property, that they actually have 17 units that are set aside to households that have incomes at 60% or below. Those units, just since we didn't talk about them last time, they have 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. They're the exact same as the market rate units, so you wouldn't know them, if you walked into the building, you wouldn't know one from the other. Same amenities, same sizes, all of that. The waiting list on those 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units ranges from 170 households to 222 households for each one of those unit types. So combined, almost 600 people are on that waiting list for those 17 units. Shorewood also has some naturally occurring affordable housing, which we talked about last time. This is particularly prevalent in Shorewood now that some of these newer luxury market rate units have come online. As a result, the older properties, in order to compete with those new luxury properties, have had to lower their rents, or at least not increase rents quite as much as they otherwise may have. And some of those are sort of what we would refer to as naturally occurring affordable units. So they're not contractually obligated to rent to people who have incomes below a certain level. They're not contractually obligated to keep their rents below a certain level. They just happen to, because of market forces in this case, are keeping their rents lower to the extent that they would be affordable to someone with an income around 60% of the area median income. Having said that, the demand gap analysis that we,
Quick question, do you have any idea, like just a ballpark on the number of naturally occurring affordable housing units?
not off the top of my head, but we can put that in the report, yeah, for sure. Because we do have a chart in the report that sort of shows the properties that are below this sort of line, and then you can find it in the last presentation too, are what we would consider the naturally occurring units, so I can add those up to the extent that they were able to give the unit mixes, which not all of them were actually, but we could try. And so the final point on this is just, as we talked about last time, there can be these naturally occurring affordable units. That's great that the market has those, but because they're not obligated to rent them to people with incomes below a certain income threshold or keep their rents below a certain income threshold, they're not always available to households that have these lower incomes. So in this case, a significant percentage of them, these naturally occurring affordable housing units, are actually being occupied by people with higher incomes. So as a result, they're not available to people with low incomes.
Can I just ask back to the
Yes.
student population with respect to affordability, if they don't have any income, so is it typically parent, I mean, if they have a co-sign by a parent, is that income factored in? Is there a student that basically?
In order to qualify to live at
Well, I mean, just in terms of the data.
Oh, yeah, so a large student population is actually going to typically skew the data to make it look like there is more of an affordability problem than there actually is. There's no way, because that number is so small, so the more specific that you get with the kind of data that you're trying to get out of this data set, the American Community Survey, the larger those margins of error. So for example, I think it's around 1,100 people in Shorewood are enrolled in college and graduate school. But that margin of error is, I don't remember the exact number, but something around 200. So it could be plus, so it's quite large, so that knowing what that number is it's a pretty big range. So then if you then also want to know, what about people enrolled in college who are also renters, who are also low income, who are also, you get to a point where the estimate might be 50 plus or minus 50. Yeah, so it becomes very difficult to know that for sure. So then the housing gaps that we talked about last time, senior-friendly housing, updated move-in ready supply, energy efficient supply, housing for persons with special needs, and affordable housing, both rental as well as owner. Okay, so this is the bulk of what I want to talk about today. These are the 4 questions that were put out in the RFP, and this is what is listed as sort of what the recommendations are that you guys are looking for, and we'll just sort of go through them one by one. So the first question is, what types of housing, either owner-occupied or rental, and the market or affordable, assisted, elderly, special needs, workforce, student, young, professional, etc., will not be met by supply in the short, medium, and long term? So, we talked about what gaps are currently there, right? We talked about how affordable housing, there's a gap there. Affordable housing gaps that exist now are likely to continue to exist in the future without any sort of specific intervention. Why would that be? Well, basic economics, it's supply and demand, right? Demand for Shorewood is high, and we don't think that it's going to go down anytime soon. It's highly walkable, it has good schools, it's very close to multiple labor markets, including Milwaukee, and I will say, it seems like some of the, enough of the sort of young population, that 20 to 34, they're not all enrolled in college and grad school, right? A lot of those people are, young professionals who have decided to stay in Shorewood, either because they lived here when they were going to college and they really liked it, or they just want to be close to downtown Milwaukee if that's where their job is, or wherever. You have really good interstate access, so we don't think that Shorewood's desirability is going to go down anytime soon. So demand is going to either remain the same or in fact potentially increase. And then to complement that, mortgage interest rates are not projected to actually rise again until 2022, and even at that point it's a fairly minimal increase. And so between those two things, demand for housing in Shorewood stays the same, probably rises. So without any kind of action on the supply side, the prices are going to continue to go up, right? That's just basic economics.
Can I ask a question? For affordability, gap exists and may worsen. What is you get this all the time. What is affordability?
So in this case, we're defining affordability specifically as households that are not cost burdened. So households that are not paying more than 30% of their rent, or 30% of their income towards rent plus utilities if you're a renter, or towards your mortgage insurance, property taxes if you're an owner.
So they're paying less than
30%.
30% of their income to housing.
And that's a very standard definition of affordability in the sort of housing world. So supply. Absent any additions to supply, then prices are going to continue to rise. So that's sort of the preliminary finding, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. But adding supply, while it's a necessary thing to do to try to tackle affordability and price appreciation, it's not sufficient to address the specific gaps that we've talked about, right? Because adding supply could mean just adding anything. Another market rate luxury apartment complex. But is that going to address the gaps that we talked about before? And I'll come back to that later because I actually do think there's a way that sort of 3 or 4 steps removed, it could actually help. So I wouldn't say that that's the kind of project that you should say no to outright. But it's not specifically, directly going to address these gaps. So what types of housing could be pursued and supported was the second question. So we divide this and think about this in 2 different ways. One is what could be done to the existing housing stock, and the other is what could be done in terms of trying to incentivize and get new housing stock. So the existing housing stock, given its age, and we talked about this last time, another thing that makes Shorewood really unique is the age of the housing stock. Much older housing stock here when compared to other surrounding comparable communities. So energy efficiency upgrades. This is something that lots of communities nationwide who are sort of in the inner suburb ring or even urban centers are doing to their older housing stock rather than demolishing them, which is not cost efficient. Oftentimes it's not good for the environment, all of these other reasons. Sort of subsidizing or trying to incentivize energy efficiency upgrades.
That doesn't necessarily affect supply. It's some other
Correct.
demand.
Correct. So that's more of the housing gap, like that we talked about. So senior-friendly modifications, again, not necessarily specifically.
Is that when he said doesn't necessarily, is that you're too removed because people might go people that can afford it might go into energy efficiency if there were upgrades and then have the affordable units?
Oh, he was saying it doesn't necessarily directly impact supply, and I'm saying true, yeah. It doesn't necessarily impact supply, so it doesn't really have a direct correlation with the affordability component. This is just more broadly the things that you could do.
Well, would it be that your utility bill goes down?
It absolutely could be, yeah.
So that would make it more affordable.
Yeah. Depending on whether you're paying for those upgrades up front. So that's one of the things that I'll come back to at the end, but absolutely the energy efficiency upgrades. I think it's a great program that lots of municipalities are doing. They've moved money from, for example, down payment assistance programs into this kind of program to try to assist people to sort of do these kinds of upgrades. Senior-friendly modifications, that could be anything from, accessibility improvements outside of the home, so that, if there's stairs that you have to go to get into the home, wheelchair ramps, all the way up to adding a bathroom and or a bedroom on the main living floor so that senior who can't otherwise find a single-family home that has everything on the same floor can stay in that home, age in place, and not have to necessarily immediately move out when they find themselves unable to use the stairs.
Can I ask an ignorant question?
Yes, not
Well, I'm going to ask a lot tonight probably. Do those modifications impact the saleability of the home to the next? Is that a positive? Is it a negative? Is it a non-factor?
That's not an ignorant question at all. That's a really good question. I honestly don't know the answer to that. I don't know if anybody's even studied it. I can surmise that it could improve the resale value because if in a community that doesn't have a lot of senior-friendly housing supply, you then find yourself needing to move into some kind of additional care, you now have a house that's already set up in that senior-friendly design that somebody else might want to buy. So, I mean, but it could also operate the other way.
Does it limit the demand?
Right.
Could it limit
Yes,
the
so it
demand?
also operates the other way in the sense that somebody might not want that. But, you know, I don't know, do you know, is a bedroom and a bathroom on the main level really going to be something that a family is going to oppose? I don't know that that's negative enough to offset the potential positive.
Isn't the senior population in general nationally going up? So I would assume that if you make your housing units senior accessible, that you're accommodating, the value of the house would remain or go up because you have more people looking for that.
Well, it seems like,
It's
I
perfectly
guess my
reasonable.
point is, I can think of 1,000 unintended consequences of doing that,
Yes.
both positive and
Yes,
negative.
yes.
You don't sort of know where you're going to end up 10 years down the road.
Right. Or you make the investment right now and in 1 year you have to move.
Right.
Yeah. Or, I mean, this would be my concern if it were my house, which is it's an older home. You don't know what you're going to come into, what's going to happen when you start to break down those walls and mess with that plumbing. So it could end up being significantly more expensive than it initially seemed. So this is, I mean, you know, renovations to older housing stock is always a risky endeavor, but given the lack of sort of single-story supply, I feel like it's worth noting. And then infill construction and redevelopment. You guys don't have a lot of available land, obviously. You know, I know that, you know that. That's not an unknown thing. One thing that we did hear from some people was that there's more redevelopment going on in other comparable communities. In other words, an older home that maybe in Whitefish Bay might be demolished and a new home be constructed. Here, it's not being done. That sort of activity hasn't really hit this market. Some communities, and not necessarily not these comparable communities that we're talking about, but in other parts of the country, have also used this as a way to say, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, but say, okay, we're going to take down a duplex that has two sort of townhouses next to each other, and we're going to rebuild a four-unit flats, basically, 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs. So now we've added 2 additional housing units to the market, same physical structure, just smaller units. Okay, so that's the existing housing stock. New housing stock opportunities, condominium project. We did hear that there is demand for additional condos in Shorewood for a variety of reasons. One is it sort of inherently has that senior-friendly design. It's a single level for the most part. Not all of them, but a lot of the newer ones with an elevator. It provides affordable to some extent, not affordable based on the previous definition, but affordable as in lower prices. Owner-occupied opportunities, just inherently because a condo is cheaper than a single-family house. Another possibility would be another rental project. Again, most of what you guys have done in the recent past, and by recent I guess I mean 2013 till now, has been these sort of luxury market rate developments. They've been well received. The Oaks at Shorewood is the one that targets seniors. It's also been well received. It was built, I think it closed in 2017 and don't quote me on that. But it's full. It's 95% occupied. It's doing well. I will say they tend to offer specials, which oftentimes we think of that as like, oh, maybe you're overpriced. You know, you should come down on your prices. But sometimes it's used as a marketability tool, so it doesn't necessarily indicate a soft market. Given their occupancy and their level of demand that they reported, I think that it's doing well. A mixed-use project. Again, this would be some kind of housing. It could either be owner-occupied or rental. On the upper stories with commercial on the ground floor. An affordable housing project, this could be either owner or rental. Accessory dwelling units, we've talked about this in the last few meetings. This is something that is quite common in other areas where the communities are essentially built out, like Shorewood, where there's not a lot of available land to add. So this is a way that they're thinking, how can we add new units? What can we possibly do? Okay, accessory dwelling units. They're small, they're on a single-family home lot. Oftentimes they're in a garage that's been retrofitted or above a garage. It could be in a basement, that sort of thing. And then co-housing options. And this I put on there because it was something that we discussed at the sort of listening sessions that we had at the beginning. It is growing in appeal nationwide. It hasn't completely caught on yet, but I think a lot of that is because people don't really know what it is. And if there's interest in doing that here in Shorewood, or allowing that here in Shorewood, from my perspective, that's a way that you could essentially open up some units. So if there's 5 people who are all currently living in their own single-family homes, but would really like to live together, but can't because of zoning restrictions, if you change that zoning restriction, now they can live together. Now you've opened up those 4 homes to other potential occupants. So it's not new housing per se, but you have released some of that housing potentially, or has the potential to. All right, what are the barriers that exist to the development of these types of housing? We talked about it already, but the lack of available land, zoning regulations, construction costs, and just general public opinion. There's a lot of pushback in communities that are primarily single-family home and duplex, sort of lower density communities, pushback because people don't want higher density. It's more traffic, it's more crime, it's going to lower my property value, those sorts of things. Or it's just not the community that I bought in, and I don't really like, I want to preserve the character of the neighborhood that I purchased in. This is what I chose to buy in, and I want to sort of keep it the way that I like it.
Quick question. Are those meant to be general in nature, just kind of generally these are the barriers, or did you do any
This
kind of
is general as well as Shorewood specific. So these are things that all came out in the meetings as well as the interviews that we had.
Okay, just wondering if you could dive into like the joint zoning regulations and identify kind of which regulations, or if that was more of a
No,
zoning
that's
regulation.
deeper. Yeah, we didn't go that.
Earlier you talked about non-family households. How does that differ from co-housing that was on your last?
So that would be a non-family. If you were co-housing, that would be a non-family household. Co-housing is sort of intentional in the design, the way that it's designed. So it has, it's more like almost like a sorority or a fraternity house in a way. So
Co-housing, that's a co-housing model.
Correct. So there's a community space that's intentionally designed that people would share that community space. Oftentimes it's like everyone still has their own little house, but they have a community sort of building, if you will, that has a kitchen and a gathering space. So it's a little different.
So this
But
is
they would-
typically then newer, you're not doing this within the existing housing?
It's typically newer. Some places I've seen where they've taken an old condo building, like a small condo, maybe a 4-unit or an 8-unit condo building, and made that into, so they might take an 8-unit condo building, take one of those condos away, make that the community space, and then have the other 7 units remain.
They have them on, right off of Brady Street. There's, I think, 1 or 2.
What's it called? What street?
Brady
Here?
Street in Milwaukee.
Oh, okay.
The co-op, yeah, I've been there for a while.
Okay.
Well, they sound like co-ops in
And they're
Madison.
small.
Yeah, co-ops. It's like a co-op, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, what housing demands will likely not be met without intervention, subsidy, incentives, innovative programs, code revisions, et cetera? So these are, again, affordable housing in the sense of the official definition now, but also in the sense of simply lower priced homes and lower priced apartments are unlikely to be sort of met based purely on market forces. They haven't produced them so far. Why would you not maximize your return, right? It just doesn't make sense. Nobody's going to do that. So affordable housing units, and this is true everywhere, this is not specific to Shorewood, they always require some kind of incentive, some kind of subsidy. Housing for persons with disability under 55 years of age, I say that specifically because if you have a disability and you're over 55, you're eligible for River Park. But if you're under 55 and you have a disability, you are not eligible for River Park. That's not completely unique, but it is a little bit unique. A lot of times Section 8 properties for seniors will allow people with a disability, even if you're under 55, to live there. In this case, that's not true. So we did get quite a bit of interest from people both in the survey as well as the listening sessions of people who had adult-age children with disabilities who were really looking for some kind of way for them to become independent, to live independently. And that currently doesn't exist. That's not something that the market has produced. It's very unlikely to produce it in the future. This is something that traditionally is done by a nonprofit organization that has that as part of their mission, or affordable housing as part of their mission. So again, not saying that that's something that the Shorewood Community Development Authority should do, just that that's something that's not going to be met by market forces.
So that's not a federal guideline or a requirement that, because I know the
That you have to
Milwaukee,
live, yeah, it's very,
Milwaukee housing
I thought it was very
definitely has
strange.
younger people there if they have disabilities.
Yeah, lots of Section 8 properties that we work on that are seniors allow you to be eligible, but I confirmed it 3 or 4 times with them, so that's what they say. I don't know if that could be a fair housing violation on their part, I don't know, it's just, that's specifically what they said.
Can you give us an example of what that housing for persons with disability under 55 years of age, where's the nearest one? Do you know?
Oh, yes, I do. Do you want me to pull up a map, or do you want me to just generally tell you?
Just
In Milwaukee.
Yeah.
like-
There's 2 or 3 in
Locust
Milwaukee,
Court.
on the north
Which one?
and
Locust
west
Court,
side.
right there on Locust
Locust Court, okay.
and Humboldt.
Yep.
All the senior towers in Milwaukee are all both.
Well, and there's also specifically housing for persons with disabilities. So you're talking more about the senior projects, where if you have a disability, you would also be eligible. There are specifically also projects for people living with disabilities in Milwaukee. And they're in the very first presentation and in the final report, there will be a map that will have the locations.
I have a question. So for Shorewood, we don't have a lot of land, so would it make sense to combine a senior and affordable housing and the disability? Is that, you're going to get your recommendations, I know, right?
Yes and no, but yes.
Okay.
Yes and no when we get to the recommendation. So would it make sense? Yes. Like I said, I find it's rare. I don't know that I've ever actually, I don't want to say
Yeah,
that
why
it doesn't
would you
exist
not
anywhere
do
else,
that?
but why would you not do that? Yeah. They need a lot of the same services. Other than maybe you have, relatively young people who are perfectly functional adults living with disabilities who are maybe in their 30s that might not want to be in a housing development where the average age is 75.
Well, they're doing it now, though, in the Section 8, right, or those, is it condos? What are they?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Then you've got
absolutely.
students and you've got.
They've been
you know,
doing that
saying-
for 20 years
Yeah,
at least
yeah.
in Milwaukee.
Just saying it's normal here.
Oh, yeah, no, it's absolutely normal. Yeah, I completely agree.
So, and I'm sorry, so did you hear did this come up more for Shorewood than maybe you have heard from other communities, a desire for this specifically?
I will say that it did, yes.
And do you think,
I will-
again, it gets back to the walkability and the
It's
sort of the nature of Shorewood, or?
It's that, but I also think it's just an advocacy thing, if you have a group of people who are really passionate, the parents of many of these young adults were just really passionate
Sure.
about this issue. They've been trying for years, according to them, to try to get something like this in Shorewood, have not been successful, and every opportunity they get to sort of talk about this passion, they're going to do that. So I think that's more what it was. But having said that, again, if there is a group of people, it's just like with co-housing. There were some seniors who came to the original listening sessions who really wanted co-housing. If there's a group of people who really want this, but
But it's also
and
data
it's
supported.
relatively doable. Pardon?
This isn't just based on what you've heard, it's also data supported, correct?
It's data supported in the sense that there are no housing opportunities in
Right,
Shorewood,
right,
correct?
right.
For a person, yes,
Yeah.
in that sense, absolutely. It's data. And I will say that Shorewood has a smaller percentage of the population who are adults, who are not institutionalized, who are living with a disability than other areas that we looked at. But it's not significantly. I mean, significantly in the statistical sense, yes, it's significantly less, but not significantly in the magnitude sense.
And we're including physical and developmental disability together, right?
Yes.
And is Riverview Park, is that privately owned?
Yes, right, but it's a Section 8 property, so it is a government.
And I'm sorry, so,
You're making me want to call them out and
I
double
agree.
check, because I asked 3 times because I thought this was shocking, but
Well, we
like,
don't have
I didn't know that
housing
Lighthorse had the affordable units till I called back them either and said, I saw in a document you were required to have these affordable units, and they were like, oh, we do have affordable units. And I said, well, we didn't talk about these last time.
They have to be, because we are the housing authority, the CDA, so unless the housing authority owns it, it would have to be private. And
But they
usually-
follow Section 8 guidelines.
well, we can find that out. We don't need
Yes,
to
yeah, I
get
don't
into
know.
details on that here. I'm curious, so you said obviously there is no stock for this. How do we
No.
compare to our peer communities around us? Are we unique in that, or does Whitefish Bay have them, and everybody, so nobody's got them?
Milwaukee has them.
Well, other than,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
We have to go, and that's also not uncommon, that you would have to go to the major sort of urban core to get this kind of specific housing. But again, this is true, it's about, if I remember correctly, it'll be in the final report, the exact number, but I think it was 7 to 8% of the population in Shorewood. I mean, it's a small, relatively small percentage of the population. The market is not typically going to respond to something like that, and that's true everywhere.
just the disability, but not the senior,
Correct.
Okay,
Just
just
persons with
combine them
disability.
in
Yeah.
larger
And
percentage?
just out of curiosity, again, obviously, the school system in Shorewood is so great. Is it possible that the school system and the support that the school system can provide is drawing people, that they're
Yeah.
related to some degree?
No one specifically told me that, but I wouldn't be surprised given the way that they talked about how great that support network was within the public school system. So they didn't say, I moved to Shorewood because the school system had this,
Yeah.
but they did talk about how what the school system provided has actually made them even more passionate about the fact that they think that their children can live independently because they already have these skill sets that were really fostered and developed and
They're
nurtured.
getting half the answer.
Exactly.
Can I ask the opposite?
Sure.
The exact opposite. So if you're saying the market in Shorewood and anywhere really won't provide for these things, which is pretty basic, if you know about market failures, then the opposite, are you saying that anything but these three the market can provide in Shorewood?
Give me an example.
Like market rate apartments.
Oh, well, yes.
So we're looking at from a CDA, from the village perspective of what should you subsidize, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
And these have always been on my radar because they're market failures. But then the question is, in this community, is market rate apartments or housing, is there a real need for it? Because developers can always show you there is, but did you look at that?
Well, I'll say, this is one thing. So this is what of the gaps that we identified. So that's why those sorts of other things wouldn't be on this list. But just in terms of market rate housing, I thought a lot about this, and actually, the vacancy rate in the rental market here is very low, very, very low. And so a developer who tells you there's a demand for more market rate luxury apartment units is not incorrect in that sense. But it is a question of, if you build it, will they come? I mean, if you build it, they will come. So is the demand already in Shorewood for that kind of a product? Or if you build that product, are you basically just allowing more people from other communities to move into Shorewood who would otherwise want to be here? You know, that's a question of what you want. But I think that a developer who tells you, yes, there's demand for market rate housing is correct.
So going back to the question, I don't know if you specifically studied this, but like Milwaukee has a policy, to not subsidize market rate housing downtown.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they follow it now or not, but would you say that there's a need to subsidize that type of project?
So I will talk about this in a second, but to answer your question specifically, I would say I don't really think that a 100% affordable project is going to pass in Shorewood. And I say that for several reasons. That was actually my primary recommendation, which we'll come to later, but 100% senior affordable project, I actually do think there could be support for that.
I agree.
But these kinds of projects always get very strong resistance. And if you add to that the density issue, if we heard a lot in the meetings that people really did not like the higher density stuff, you end up with sort of overlapping groups of people who are going to actively advocate against that project. So knowing that.
That's your catch-22 then, right?
Yes.
When you have demands and you have gaps, but nobody wants
Nobody
density,
wants to address the
you can't
gaps.
solve any of the problems.
So one possibility would be something like Light Horse, in the sense that it does have some affordable units, but it also has the market rate luxury.
But the subsidy is a tax credit. Does the village then have to add more subsidy, I guess? So in other words, there is programs to do what the Light Horse did. It's tax credits from the state.
Yeah, federal and state, yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess because we're the village, we're just looking for some
Are
advice.
you asking if you would have to give additional subsidies on top of the tax credits that an affordable project? So if a developer comes to you and says, I want to build a Section 42 low-income housing tax credit project, and are you going to have to give them more money? Is that what you're asking?
Well, more like, I know what you're about to say, because I agree 100%. We're never going to get a 100% affordable housing unit unless it's senior-oriented. I could have told you that from the beginning, because our population doesn't want that. However, what you just said is, you can get another Light Horse, like something like that, so if you have that gap in that market of 60%, whatever it was, yeah, I think we have 600 people on the waiting list, so we have 600 units that can be built that people want to move into.
For the 60%?
For that 60%, and how would you get that unless you'd have to integrate it into market rate? So I get that, and you need to subsidize it because it's lower than market rate rent. And in order to do that, that's what the tax credits are for. So is there, in your analysis, do we not have enough demand that would pay that with just the tax credits to make it affordable to build? Does the village need to step in?
No, I don't think, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, would a Section 42 property be viable here, independent of the public opinion, without any subsidy from the village?
No, no.
Sorry,
Because
I don't
public opinion
understand.
is, sorry, public opinion would not allow
Yes, I
us
agree.
elected officials to build a completely affordable housing unit. I think you've gotten that part, right? Right, just 100%. But, so what they would allow us to build is a light horse, which is a market rate apartment, right, complex, rental complex, and then have integrated units that are tax credit
Right.
available, get tax credits from the state so
From
that
the
they can become more affordable.
Right.
So with that type of construction, do you also feel there's not enough demand that the village would need to step in and subsidize it even further than the tax credits?
Okay, that is my better question. I don't think so, no. I don't think so.
I think it too depends on the scale of the
Exactly.
project.
And
You
it
know,
also
so if it's
depends
a smaller
on
one, then-
what you mean, and I guess I'll
It's
just
the
go
facts
to
and circumstances.
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
situation.
sort of what you mean by incentivized. So I think that you might be talking about, should you do a TIF district or not? Is that kind of where you were going with that? Or were you just saying, just in general?
Or anyway,
Okay.
as a gap loan. Or
Yeah, any kind of subsidy, yeah. So another way that communities have done this where they don't actually provide public financing is to do what's called a density bonus. Have you heard of that? Okay, so this is actually becoming quite common, and it's sort of a voluntary incentive-based program, but essentially what it is it says, okay, on this plot of land, the current zoning regulations would allow you to build 45 units. If, however, you agree to put 20% of those units set aside at 60% AMI, we will allow you to build more than that number of units. We will allow this density bonus to go through. This is something that, in some cases, there is, again, still the public resistance because of the density issue. In other cases, it just depends on how much you're at, how much additional units you're allowing them to have. It might be something like Lighthorse, they're only giving you 17 units. You didn't have to give them a density boost for that, but maybe if you said, normally you could build 50 units on this site, now we will allow you to build 60. Is that additional 10 units going to be something that's going to spark utter outrage? You guys would know better than I would, but I think that additional 10 units is not going to increase that density so much of that project that would be really very noticeable.
So the bonus really is just changing the zoning to allow them to do more.
Yes, correct. And it's called a density bonus, like ordinance. So it's just you could design it however you want. Some communities have it where there is like a point system. So depending on what the design of the project is, what kind of features they're going to have, how many stories they want to have, they would get fewer, sort of bonus units.
Is
If
this,
it's already 6 stories, they don't want it to be 8 stories, so they're not going to allow as many, that sort of thing.
is this property specific? Like, I could see that happening here in the quadrant, like the North Shore Bank on Capitol and Oakland, like that area for
Yep,
this
that's
entire,
exactly where I was thinking.
but other places I don't think that would fly if it caused another story.
It's project specific, so you would
Okay.
write, it would be written into almost as if it was a conditional use permit, so it would be entirely, like the developer would have to come to you and say, I want to get additional, this density bonus, I want to qualify for it, here's my proposal. You would have a plan written though, that would say you get this many additional units for X, you get this many
So
additional
like a
units for
TIF
Y.
plan, a project
Yeah,
plan,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it's density bonus.
Yep. And you can specify which areas you want, you would even allow this to go into effect, so that way it's not sort of community-wide. So you end up saying only along these commercial corridors.
Where do you do that?
The areas that you said.
I'm just saying, where do you specify?
Oh, in the
that?
plan.
So we don't have a redevelopment plan or anything like that, like Milwaukee and other cities.
Mhm.
But, so I'm just wondering where we have zoning and we have, I guess, a comp plan that we're going to be doing for a land use map. Which one of those two?
So
would
you would